Conventionally, I ring a bell, but I'm without a bell today, so I'm ringing a bell. Thank you, Philip. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday the 30th of October 2025, Burlington House and online. Dr. Sam Lucy, Honorary Director, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday the 23rd of October 2025 were read and signed. The Honorary Secretary read the name of a new fellow who was then admitted to the Society. The following communication was then laid before the Society towards a national collection, unlocking the potential of digital collections by Rebecca Bailey. Thanks for return for this communication. The Honorary Director announced that the next meeting would be an out of London meeting at York on Thursday the 6th of November, then adjourned the meeting, a reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as true and complete record? I can see everyone who's there, so that is voting it. Thank you very much. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting. I must say it's always a delight to be with the Antiquaries in York, and this evening it's a particular pleasure to welcome Professor Maureen Carroll to her own department to lecture on behalf of the Society. Maureen is known to most of you, I suspect, a very distinguished archaeologist of the Roman world, who's done work initially in Germany and in Italy, and currently leading an AHRC project on burials from Roman York. Her interests and publications cover a wide range, including, of course, important work on Roman burial. And this evening, she's going to do a lecture for us, which covers a spectrum of those interests, linking York to Italy. Her paper is An Etruscan Lady in York, Grand Tour and Antiquarian Collections in the Yorkshire Museum. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction. It was lovely to see you here tonight, and lovely to see so many of you coming out tonight for this talk. I think I should give a bit of a background to this particular project. I started teaching at the University of York during COVID in 2020. That whole first year was spent in my study at home in front of a screen. But as soon as COVID was over, I took a tour through the Yorkshire Museum and, of course, made a beeline for the Roman Gallery. And whilst wandering through there, saw an artifact in the collection that stopped me dead in my tracks, because it is neither from York nor is it Roman. It is, in fact, Etruscan. And when I contacted the museum whether they would have any interest in me looking into it, they were very pleased for me to do so. And I was very pleased to get 2 rounds of funding from the University of York to investigate this artifact and do a whole suite of investigations on it. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is one artifact, but I'm talking about its discovery, its identification, its contextualization, its procurement, and its display, everywhere from when it was made to the present day when it is still in the Roman Gallery in York, but now with a proper label. So, as I say, when I first went through the museum, this was the object that I saw, looking the worse for wear, looking quite grimy and dirty. It was clear, though, that it was a woman reclining on a couch with cushions. And immediately I thought of the many Etruscan cinerary urns and chests that I had seen in towns of Tuscany. And I thought it looked like it must be one of those, and it was worth looking into. The label said it was a lady of leisure holding a lamp, without giving any date. And I guess when that label was made, it was probably because one didn't really quite know what to do with the object. It didn't look right, and yet it is funerary, so we'll put it in the Roman York Gallery. That's no one's fault, because the original information on the provenance of the piece clearly had been forgotten or got lost. But what you can see here is the lid of a square box that was used to contain the cremated remains of an individual. And on the lid is carved this lady. These are fairly common in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC in Tuscany, in Etruria. And the sex of the individual on the lid reflects the sex of the individual in the box. You can see it here before it was cleaned, and it was very clear to me that it was imperative that we have a professional clean of this object to see whether we could see any more details and whether there might still be some paint associated with it. So just in case you're not quite certain where Etruria was and what region I'm talking about, the map shows you in dark green the heartland of the Etruscans, Rome, one of Rome's bitterest enemies in the pre-Roman period. And Etruria, of course, expanded up to northern Italy and as far south as Campania. But the dark green area is where they were primarily based. Now, these ash chests that I've mentioned were set up in family tombs in Etruria. These are large, usually circular underground tombs that are made to accommodate multiple members of a family and extended families. This material that is associated with funerary practice was a useful means in the Etruscan period to distinguish oneself or one's family from others, often leading to very impressive funerals and monuments, and this was certainly the case, as you can see, with this type of tomb. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with some of the Etruscan tombs that were brightly painted when they were first discovered in the 18th and 19th century. They went around the world with some furore. But some communities developed less elaborate funerary monuments, and in that category I would put these ash chests. And that happened during the 3rd to the 1st century BC, when they stop. In the end of the 1st century, these ash chests are no longer made. But by then, of course, Etruria is under Roman control, and the Romans had different funerary practices, which the Etruscans then adopted for themselves. Here are just a couple on the left-hand side. Quite often, the sides of these ash chests are decorated with scenes from Greek and Italic mythology, battle scenes primarily, which don't seem to really jibe with the sex of the individual on top necessarily. But sometimes we also have family scenes which reflect, I think, perhaps more domestic situations. But the battle scenes are by far more popular. And we can see a woman at the top reclining, and she's wearing luxurious clothing, resting with one arm on 2 cushions, and she's holding a fan in one hand, a symbol of status. The one at the bottom is a man who has a naked torso and wearing a tunic around the lower half of the body. He has a garland draped around his neck and chest, and he's holding a patera, a cup in which wine or some other material was placed for sacrifices. So we can see gendered roles quite clearly reflected in the iconography of these ash chest lids. Now, I was very pleased here at the University of York that I had a whole range, and still do have a whole range, of colleagues who were keen to help out on various aspects of this project. The money came from the University of York to clean, to document, to do pigment analysis on and 3D scan the Etruscan sculpture at York. And here we can see 2 of my colleagues, a former colleague, Neil Kivot, doing photogrammetry and documenting the sculpture before it was cleaned, and my digital archaeology colleague, Colleen Morgan, taking photographs and digital photographs and recording it. So we have a good record of what it looked like before it was cleaned. I was happy to recruit a colleague, a conservator from Durham University, Vicky Garlick, who came down on 2 days to, first of all, hoover the sculpture, then put all kinds of chemicals on it, remove fragments and so on. It was a long drawn out affair, but it was necessary, and we learned a lot about the surface preservation and other details when she was doing that. So you're probably thinking when you see this, I can't really see the difference too well. But when I show you the other side of it, it will become clear. So on the left-hand side is the sculpture before it was cleaned, and you can see the accumulation of lots of dirt and grime around the foot and leg area and around the back. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Etruscan lady after she's been cleaned. One thing you should note is that you can now, without the grime on the stone, see that it was very finely grey veined stone. And that was an important clue to the type of stone that this ash chest was made of. And here I think you can see this much more clearly, particularly at the foot end and at the back of the sculpture. A lot of that black grit has been removed. And there you can see the grey veining in the stone, perhaps more clearly. We, of course, have no idea where this sculpture had stood before it came into the museum in York, or where it might have been kept. It might have been exposed to the elements. It's very difficult to say, but at any rate, it hadn't been handled with care. But by cleaning it, various details of the sculpture became clear. For example, we can see that the object held by the woman in her right hand is not a lamp, it's a pomegranate. And the pomegranate, of course, is an object in antiquity that was very symbolic of life and particularly fertility, and therefore deemed particularly appropriate for a female. We can see the beading and the decoration, the embroidered decoration on her cloak. We can see that she's wearing like a little skull cap. She's also wearing a very large ring, which makes her, obviously, I like big rings. She's very sympathetic to me to see that she's wearing them too. So status, embroidered clothing, some sort of a headdress. She's also wearing a jewelry on her, around her neck. She's wearing a necklace, and she's got bangles on one arm and a ring on this arm. So we can see that at a first glance, this is a woman of some status and probably from a rather wealthy family. And here is the 3D model that was produced by my digital colleagues at the university, Heritage 360. And the advantage of having a 3D model is that you can rotate it and turn it around and see it from all different angles. But I'm showing you only a couple stills. They show the sculpture, I think, probably in a better condition than it really looks like in real life. Now, the color. It's very clear that this ash chest lid was not simply plain stone in antiquity. There is basically no such thing as plain stone in antiquity, whether Greek, Etruscan, or Roman. Sculptures on buildings, or independent sculptures or reliefs on buildings or monuments such as these were always brightly painted. And you can see the most beautiful, I think, of the Etruscan women from the British Museum up at the top here in London. The other examples are from various museums in Tuscany. These ash chests come in a variety of materials. Some of them are made of volcanic tufa stone that was perhaps prevalent in the area where the chests were made. Others are made of alabaster, and some of them are made of terracotta, like the one in the middle. And the terracotta ones are the ones that are most brightly painted. But as far as the stone ones are concerned, it's likely that the stone was covered with a layer of thin plaster, like a plaster wash, and then color applied on top of that. And so we thought it was worthwhile doing an analysis of the pigments. It was a disappointing analysis. My colleague Gareth Perry did an examination of the samples that Vicky Garlick had taken from the surface, and all we could ascertain was that the sculpture had been coated with a layer of plaster, but the pigments that would have been on it had disappeared. No pigments survived. So with my ham-fisted IT skills, I've come up with a very rough best guess reconstruction of the colours that might have been present on this sculpture based on comparative pieces in various Etruscan museums. And the yellow is often used to highlight gold. And so we can see that I've highlighted her bangles, her necklace, the belt under her breasts, and the ring in gold. A dark red or purple is a common color, green as well. So this is based on some comparanda. The next question was, where did this sculpture come from? Etruria is a big place, and there are three particular Etruscan towns that have very large collections of ash chests made of these materials I mentioned. And these are Volterra, Chiusi, and Perugia. And so in a second round of funding, I applied to have money to take a trip to Etruria to check out the museums and to see if I could find anything that looked very similar to ours, doing a stylistic analysis, not just the type of stone or material that the ash chest is made of, but also whether stylistically I could find anything that was very similar. It was an utterly enjoyable trip. I saw a lot and learned a lot and had a wonderful time looking at Tuscan landscapes, as you can see here. So after visiting Volterra and Perugia and not finding any real comparative pieces, I then came to Chiusi, ancient Clusium, and there was where I think our sculpture was made. There were numerous parallels to that. This is the typical type of Etruscan cinerary chest in Chiusi, made of alabaster. Alabaster is the local stone, and these are all made of that material. There are men and women reclining on chests, but I've shown you three here that have quite a lot of similarity with the lid in the Yorkshire Museum. A reclining woman, similarly dressed, in the same pose, often holding different things in their hands. So the woman on the right is holding a wine cup, a rather elaborate one, which is quite unusual. The one in the middle is holding the heart-shaped leaf fan, and the one on the right is holding a patera or bowl. And you can see some of the scenes of battle on the front of these sarcophagi. So there was something vaguely familiar just going through the museum and seeing these. But then I found this one, which I would like to say looks like a sister piece to me. It's the piece at the top from Chiusi. First of all, it's a woman in the same position. She's made of the same alabaster. You can see the grey veining in the stone there much more clearly than on our piece. And for comparison, I have our ash chest at the bottom. So she has exactly the same type of clothing on. She has the same type of jewelry, although she appears to have more rings than Our Lady. She's holding an object in her right hand, which is not a pomegranate. It looks like a book roll or a script roll, or perhaps a long container of some kind. But the comparanda, the points are so similar. I did wonder whether this might have come from exactly the same workshop in Chiusi. And that, I think, really brings it home. When you look at them, you can see that they really are very, very similar indeed, right down to the facial expressions and the rather large fleshy lips that are used, and the shape of the nose. Everything is very similar. What is also similar is the short hair, or the hair pulled back from the face, which is quite unusual on these Etruscan ash chests, because usually the women wear their hair open or tied at the back in some sort of a bun. But both these women have their hair pulled back from their faces, and they seem to be wearing a skull cap. That's very unusual. I have yet to quite figure out what the skull cap might mean, but this can't be a coincidence. Nothing on these sculptures is a coincidence. And I have wondered whether this might be the headgear or regalia, perhaps, of a priestess or something like that, rather than just an ordinary woman. But you can see the similarities also with the little curl of hair in front of the ears on the cheeks. If it's not from the same workshop, it's from a very close one. Even down to the cushions, which have these little points on them. They've been bashed and broken off, but you can still see where they once were on the York example are present on the Chiusi example. So I feel or felt fairly certain, looking at these pieces, that our Etruscan lady originally came from Chiusi in Etruria. But a stylistic analysis is not quite enough, and we do have the material itself to analyze. And to add scientific weight to the attribution of the sculpture to Chiusi, a petrographic analysis of the stone was done by colleagues in Palermo, by Giuseppe Montana in Palermo. And this is my colleague Gareth Perry. We spent a very tense few minutes drilling a hole in the bottom of this sculpture. It could have gone so wrong, but it didn't. It was a very neat, precise hole that no one will ever see because it's on the bottom. And you can see the sample that we've taken there. And that was sent off to Palermo, and the petrographic analysis indicated that this is alabaster and that it is from the Chiusi region. So we have the style and we have the material to prove that. So we know she came from Chiusi, but how did she get here to York? And I'd like to spend the rest of the talk talking about that. So one of the things that became clear to me when I was doing the research at the very beginning was that the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, which was, I think founded in about 1820, 22. The Yorkshire Philosophical Society was a gathering of elite men in York who travelled and who gave donations to the society. And those objects that were donated to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society ultimately found their way into the Yorkshire Museum, the Yorkshire Museum being a museum with vast antiquarian collections. And books were kept, what was given to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society when. And you can see on this list from 1883, there's quite a random selection of objects, a stone axe, a collection of prehistoric antiquities from Ireland, Denmark, and so on, curiosities from Egypt, wood carving, Grimsby, ancient deed, a Roman urn found at Clementhorpe, and so on and so forth. But I've highlighted in red the monument, which is referred to here as a fine Etruscan tomb purchased at Rome many years ago. It doesn't say how many years ago, just that in 1883, whenever that was, it was a while ago. But interesting here is it gives the name of the donor, and that started me off on another journey, Mr. William Atkinson, and we'll come to him. So we have this information somewhere along the line. In the late 19th century, it was clear that this came from Etruria. They purchased at Rome many years ago. Also, it has to be taken with a grain of salt. Very often in these donation lists, the next largest town is named. It doesn't necessarily mean that this piece actually came from Rome. And we have the donors. So those are all important indications. So who was William Atkinson? This led me to explore this family. And this took me back to Peter Atkinson Sr., who lived in the 18th and early 19th century, who was the principal assistant to York's most important Georgian architect, John Carr, who died in 1807. And John Carr gets a lot of very fine press, Atkinson far less so, I think, unjustifiably. And here are two of the buildings built by Peter Atkinson Sr. in his partnership with John Carr, Hackness Hall and a building here in York, Bootham 51. Peter Atkinson had a son, Peter Atkinson Jr., who went into partnership with his father in 1801. And we have a portrait of this gentleman here, looking rather distinguished. He retired. I put that in speech marks because his retirement is a bit cloak and dagger and clothed in some sort of scandal that I haven't got to the bottom of. I do know that he died in Calcutta, which is interesting. But he was responsible, for example, for the Ouse Bridge in 1821 and the Fosse Bridge 1812. He's ignored more or less in York as well. Curious. And he became a member of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society in 1823 to 1833 when he retired, and his financial circumstances probably had him bow out of this illustrious society. Now, Peter Atkinson Jr. had two sons. He took his elder son, John Bonus Atkinson, into partnership in 1831, and he continued on the business. And in fact, John Bonus Atkinson became the city surveyor and engineer of the City of York Corporation, which was a very prestigious title between 1850 and 1854. And he, like his father, became a member of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society in 1844. He had a younger brother, William Atkinson, the same William Atkinson who was the donor of our piece in 1837. And it was a gigantic rabbit hole to go down to find out what these two brothers built in York. And I was astounded at the number of buildings we see today that was built by the two of them without a word of recognition. In fact, they even did repairs to this building, to the King's Manor. And for the Yorkshire Museum, the curator's cottage was built by them. But many others were built by them too. As J.B. and W. Atkinson, these two were among the most prolific architects in York during the Victorian period. And I always think of them when I walk across the Ouse Bridge. So the next piece of the puzzle, this was something that became a part of the York City Archives while I was looking into this family, and that was the passport of John Bonus Atkinson, a passport that's at least 2 meters long on parchment, dating to between 1829 and 1831, stamped with multiple stamps and handwritten signatures of the kingdoms of Italy during his grand tour. So here he is, the son of an architect, making the grand tour in 1821, and this is his passport. It's written at the top in French, and the rest of it is stamped in whatever language he traveled through, mostly Italian, but he also traveled through Switzerland and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands, and all those stamps are in there as well. It's an absolutely priceless document. And here is his name written at the top, John Bonus Atkinson, and you can see that it says solo. So this permit to spend time in a particular kingdom of Italy means that his permit relates to him alone. He's traveling alone, or at least he's the head of his team, if he had a team. I found it quite interesting also to look at his physical appearance, which is described in the passport. So it tells us that he's 5'10" in English measurements, that he was 21 years old in 1829, that he had blonde hair, he had a medium forehead, whatever that means. His eyebrows are blonde, and his eyes are gray, and so on. So it kind of helped me to have a picture of this man. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a portrait or any photograph of him or his brother William, but I'll keep looking. So this was absolutely marvelous because I could go through this 2 meter long document and map out his journey in the 3 years and figure out where he actually had been and how much time he spent in each of those places, which might help us to reconstruct where he actually purchased the Etruscan sculpture. So this is his journey. In 1829, in Italy and in Switzerland, he stayed in the places that are marked with a red star. In 1830, he traveled around and visited some of the same sites again, like Naples and Rome, marked by a blue star. And in his last year on the Grand Tour in 1831, he visited Rome again, but also Florence and various other places in the north of Italy, highlighted by a pink star. So what about collecting Etruscan antiquities? I think most of us, I know that when I think of the Grand Tour, I think of the elite of Britain, France, Germany making the trip, the young sons of elite families making the Grand Tour, purchasing paintings, having paintings purposely made for them, buying Greek and Roman statues, large monuments to take home and put in their stately home gardens and so on. But I wasn't aware of people collecting Etruscan antiquities. But by the time John Bonus Atkinson is undertaking the Grand Tour, which is quite late in the history of the Grand Tour, I wonder if perhaps there weren't that many good Greek and Roman statues to be had anymore. And that sounds a bit unkind. And I think that's part of it. But I also think he came at the time when the Etruscans were being discovered and were becoming popular. I love this quote here by Montesquieu from 1729 about the British in Florence. He says, the English carry off everything from Italy, pictures, statues, portraits, but the English rarely take away things of value. The Italians let as little go as they can, for they are connoisseurs selling to a people who are not. So if you think I was being unkind, that's very harsh. But I think a pivotal person in the Grand Tour of John Bonus Atkinson and his desire to buy something Etruscan is this person here, a woman, amazingly, Elizabeth Caroline Hamilton Gray, who came from Scotland, married an English husband, and was interested in the subject of the Etruscans. In 1837, she and her husband had been to London to visit an Etruscan collection and were so smitten with it that she decided to take him to Etruria on a trip and to visit the sites and to visit sites that were just being excavated, to look at artifacts and perhaps purchase some of their own. That happened in 1837 to 39. Now, how would you do this? How would you go about this as a woman, a Scottish woman? What kind of connections would you have? I certainly find it sometimes a bit daunting to wander around through the wilds of Etruria today. But in 1837 to 1839, this took real backbone and grit and took a lot of connections. And she happened to, for one reason or another, have a lot of good ties with German and Italian archaeological circles. And she made use of them as guides or giving her hints and ideas where she could go to see the most interesting things that were being uncovered. And she returned into Britain in 1840 and published a book called The Tour to the Sepulchres of Etruria, which is available online today and is very entertaining, written at that time by a woman who is not necessarily impressed with the way things are being excavated, not very impressed with the way women are handled, and so on. This woman was quite formidable, I think. But she writes here, our next information we gained in Rome. So she's traveling around and she's gathering information, and the next bit she gains in Rome. Here we found the shops of all the dealers in antiquities filled with vases, bronzes, curious marbles, scarabei, and other gems, bas-reliefs and sculpture of more or less merit from the excavations made in Etruria. So that makes me wonder whether the entry in the Yorkshire Philosophical Society donation list, that it was a fine Etruscan tomb bought in Rome many years ago, might be right. But she didn't just see these things in Rome. She traveled around Etruria, visiting about 7 different sites, including Chiusi. Chiusi was the last site on her trip. And she writes about these cinerary urns, these ash chests that I've just been talking about here. She talks about them bearing on their lids the figures in high relief of men and women, all being, as appeared to me, of colossal size and great beauty. They are not of colossal size. I think she's exaggerating a bit here. They were in a half-sitting posture, as if reclining upon a sofa and supported by cushions. The elbow rested upon this sofa or bed, while the head was supported by the corresponding hand. So she could just as well be describing our ash chest lid. It's exactly what she's looking at. And she's not above buying things. And I like this particular excerpt where she writes, the price which was asked for this, it was an ash chest, and indeed, I may say, for cinerary urns in general at Chiusi, appeared to us very moderate after the sums for which antiquities of this class are sold in Rome, where they are uncommon. So yes, he could have picked up something in Rome, but she says they're uncommon there. They're far more prolific in the Etruscan towns, where things were being excavated at the moment she visited, and perhaps at the moment that John Bonus Atkinson visited as well. And she describes the excavations. They're not what you and I would call an excavation. It was basically searching for loot. And these things then started to flood the European markets on these Etruscan goods. And it became a popular theme then in painting at the time. And here we have Labrouste painting in 1849, the inside of one of these family tombs in Etruria, where he highlights the female and the male ash chests along the walls. So Etruscan sites were not usually part of the grand tour, but perhaps they were for him, we're not certain. If John Bonus Atkinson did go to Cusey or any other Etruscan town, he would have had to go into the countryside and seek out a guide, or more commonly, a contadino or a farmer who would show the location of opened tombs, city walls, and the like. Now, that leaves me with the thought that he could either have bought this in Cusey or in Rome. We will never know. But we know that at the time he was there, and particularly in the years thereafter, Etruscan antiquities became very popular. And so I think that our Etruscan ash chest lid, we don't know where the chest is. There's no record of it being in the possession of the museum. It could be that it was sold separately. If you could make two amounts of money out of one object, why not do that? I think it was in the estate of John Bonus Atkinson, who died in, I think it was 1874, and then clearly passed to his brother, William, who then donated it to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society in 1883, and he dies 3 years later. So what interested me, and thanks to John Finch for having discussions with me about the Grand Tour, this is the middle class Grand Tour. We're beyond the age of the elite who traveled with untold money to travel, to make connections, and also to purchase anything they wanted. This is the tail end of the Grand Tour, and this would have been a middle class tour of this family. An illustrious family in York, an accomplished family in York of architects, but certainly not the upper class. And the eldest son of the family here just got in on the tail end of the Grand Tour. So I was curious as to how he traveled and what means he would have used to travel on. Well, his passport tells us, which is absolutely amazing. He returned in 1831 to London from Ostende on the Earl of Liverpool paddle steamer. And here you have pictures, not of the Earl of Liverpool paddle steamer, but other paddle steamers of exactly the same date. That steamer was built in 1823 for passengers and mail, so certainly not elite travel by this time. And this was the Antwerp to London service. But it would have been a significant undertaking. Not everyone would have been able to do this. So there is still a certain status attached to making a trip like this. The passengers would have included professionals, business people, affluent tourists, which I suppose John Bonus Atkinson would have been, and perhaps also some lower paid and less well-off passengers on deck class. It also lists the name of the captain who was on the ship that took him back, and that was a man named Lomax, and I've tried to research him a bit, and he crops up in quite a few of the records. So he had quite a long career as a ship captain, or master, as he's referred to. So then I wondered, well, being to Italy, having been to Italy and seeing the remains in Rome, at least, of Roman temples and columns and marble statues and so on, how much did that influence John Bonus Atkinson's architecture? Did he design neoclassical buildings? Did he come back from Italy thinking, I'm going to build all these temples in York? The answer is no, he didn't. I have not found a single neoclassical building in York that he or his brother built. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But sort of tracing the social rise of this family, I found interesting as well, leading up to the elder son being sent off on the Grand Tour. There's a lot of buildings standing in York that were designed by the Atkinsons, but there are also buildings where they resided. And here we have 35 to 37 Micklegate. There's a ballet studio in there today, Fancy Dance, and an estate agent, I think. That was owned by Peter Atkinson Jr., so that's John Bonus and William's father, from 1812. And next door to it, there's Tony the tailor is on the ground floor in there today. Micklegate 39 to 41, built as offices and residence of J.B. and W. Atkinson. And they were still living there in 1851, according to the census records, which I managed to get hold of. So again, this sort of fits with the middle-class background. It's modest. But something happened. The wealth finally kicked in, because by 1861, they had left their premises on Micklegate and moved to the Mount, which of course was a very grand address. And they had number 5 Driffield Terrace built. That's the left-hand house on this terrace house on Driffield Terrace. They were living there by 1861, according to the census, with their 2 unmarried sisters, both of them categorized as ladies, aged 40 and 39. So John Bonus died here in 1874. And in 1881, William, his younger brother and the donor of our piece, and only 1 sister live here with 3 servants. And you can see at the top right, the view kind of from my house of this grand residence on Driffield Terrace, this beautiful house here. And one of these days, I will knock on the door of that house and ask the man if I would be allowed to come in and see the house and understand the living space that this family would have had when they'd made this social rise to living just off the Mount. But I haven't picked up the courage for that yet. So I asked myself, what did he design? As I say, I can't find any buildings that are neoclassical or influenced by his trip to Rome. Instead, here are just a very small selection of buildings that they built. 2 to 4 Museum Street, just around the corner from here, you can see is built in brick, and it's in the Italianate style. So perhaps he was influenced by Italian manor houses and so on, but not by ancient Greek and Roman architecture. He also built this building, 1 to 3 Duncombe Place in York, 1865. It's now, I can't remember the name of the hotel, but it's a hotel today. And here he clearly was influenced designing something in the Gothic style. Trinity Chapel on Peckett Street in York, built in 1856. That's in Pevsner, that's referred to as being built in the Byzantine style. And as far as I know, neither of the brothers were ever in Byzantium or Istanbul. So he has a very eclectic suite of buildings that he can muster up, but not one of them is neoclassical. And so I really can't say that he was influenced too much or learned too much from classical architecture. Well, once we've done all of that, the Etruscan lady was put back in her place. If you go to the Yorkshire Museum now, it's still in the Roman York Gallery. She's there, but cleaned up and with a proper label referring to the cushion and a pomegranate, no longer the lamp. And it's alabaster and so on. And then, of course, the leap is made to the Romans, that Roman art borrows heavily, and there are similarities between this Etruscan lady and depictions of the dead from Roman York. And you can see one of the connections in the lower right photo, where we have Roman women on tombstones in Roman York and in Britain in general, reclining to dine, which is the aristocratic way of dining, just like our Etruscan lady. So that is the journey she's taken us on thus far. And I think it's a welcome addition to the Yorkshire Museum to have something about its antiquarian collections explained, so that we can understand this tremendous journey that this woman undertook, not voluntarily, of course, and we can understand the milieu in which the purchaser and the donor also lived. And it just remains for me to thank a variety of people for having made this research possible. Thank you very much.
Maureen, thank you. That was fantastic. I particularly like the passport.
Yeah, me too.
I have a feeling we may be going back to passports like that.
No,
If I can sort of start the questioning and discussions, the passports are the person stamping it is writing what information on it?
What information is on it is the name of the city,
Yeah.
or the province,
Mm.
the date,
Yeah.
The name of the magistrate responsible for that.
Right.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
information. Mhm.
And they're created by sort of adding another sheet at the bottom when you run
Yeah,
out of space.
Yeah, and it really is, it looks a bit like my passport. It's really
Yeah.
covered with stamps. There's not much room left on it for any other stamps. So I suppose that would have been the thing, you
Yeah,
just
yeah.
add another piece on the end. And quite how it has survived, I think it was in the Atkinson estate. And I'd like to know what else is in the Atkinson estate.
Yeah, there's,
Any other goodies?
yeah,
Yeah,
what a wonderful textual source, but also what a wonderful stories going from the object to the buildings that they. Can I open the floor for questions and comments from others?
Okay, I have a super practical question. I'm really interested in how they brought the antiquities back again. Do you know anything about that? Because I was taken by the corners having broken off. Would they travel with John, or would they have been posted back over his grand tour time and arrived without him, or?
I would think that it would have been shipped separately. But John, you might know more about that, how antiquities was.
But yes, they buy and ship as a sort of consignment from a dealer. It was bought from a dealer. If it's bought from somebody who owns the land on which the tubes are, then it may take even longer to get back. So,
I've come across other examples where they were shipped, actually some stuff was shipped by the Royal Navy. So I'm sure it's going separately, but it depends on your network. Those were people who had proper collections, not the architects.
Yeah.
Feel a bit silly asking this question because there's a lot of people in this audience, I think, that know a lot more about this than I do, but it just struck me the address of Driffield Terrace. And I was just wondering, because that's obviously a big Roman cemetery. So is there any indication that he might have come across anything while they were building those buildings on the mount?
No,
All right.
unfortunately, I wondered that too.
Charlie Hall ought to have done.
Patrick,
Yeah, on that subject, I was going to raise as well,
Yeah.
slightly random. Number 6 Driffield Terrace is where we did an excavation. Look, I've known, just did an excavation, I suppose about 10 years ago now. And from that, the garden of that property, that the skeleton came, which has probably become as famous as any Roman skeleton in York, but allegedly it has the tooth mark of a lion in the pelvis. Whether you believe that or not is another matter, but that is the garden next door to number 5.
It was a fairly extensive cemetery
Yes,
in the garden area behind.
Yes,
the house.
it was.
I imagine there would have been cemetery remains during the building.
but I'm sure they would have seen that, but there's no indication that they kept anything or, displayed it in their grand house, although there's another reason why I'd like to get into that house.
One of the quotes you showed was disparaging about British tourists buying the goods, and the good stuff was kept in Italy. And with all the debate about whether museums should repatriate important artifacts, how true was that as a comment? Were the local regulations? Did you have to get a magistrate to approve that you were exporting goods?
Based on what Caroline Hamilton Gray wrote, you had to get, so I'm thinking of one case where there was a monastery and the priests there owned a lot of goods and she wanted to buy some, but it would have required the permission of the church and some other magistrate. It all just seemed endless and complicated, but I think perhaps that's all you would have needed. I don't know if there was anything like an export license, because these are all individual kingdoms, so each kingdom would be different and deal with antiquities the same way.
papacy kept quite close control.
Oh, yeah.
In their bits. didn't they?
Yeah.
To,
There's a question there.
to
I wanted to ask about the grime that you removed,
Mhm.
Maureen, and whether you had any evidence or thoughts on the antiquity of that. Does it relate to its original? I have no idea how those Etruscan tombs were lit, and were the candles all in there, the smoke that could have led to that, or do you think it relates to its much later history?
I think it relates to its much later history, because even in those tombs where the Etruscan ash chests are being excavated, they look very fresh. They look very fresh. The paint and the plaster is still on them. And I imagine, Andy, you can correct me, but I would imagine that before it came into the Yorkshire Museum, it would have been in perhaps the Hospitium displayed there. And that was not ideal conditions, and it could even have been outside somewhere, you know. I mean, John Bonus Atkinson could have had it in his garden for all I know, we just don't know. But it looks modern.
I suppose following up on that, I've cleaned myself certain antiquities that I know were outside quite a period of time during the 19th century. And York was a filthy place. We only had to cast our minds back to what York Minster looked like in the early 70s.
Yeah.
It would be easy for a sculpture like that, which would be in somebody's garden.
Yeah.
But, 10, 20, 30 years to probably
Yes.
sort of like that.
Yeah.
But if anybody had perhaps saved some of that dirt off the surface during cleaning, it would be possible to check what that was and compare it with.
We didn't.
Sort of much places.
We didn't save it, yeah.
One there and then other one here. Were you asking, John?
I think you may have answered my question already, but I just wondered if we could speculate about what owning this object meant to the Atkinsons, just in terms of what its meaning was once it was transported here, whether it was just sort of a general proof of being sort of well educated and well travelled, or if there was sort of more specific associations, perhaps even with it being Etruscan rather than Roman, that it'd be more up to date, as it were, or.
We could speculate, I suppose, but it would only be speculation. I think, given that when he returns to Britain, by 15 or so years later, Etruscan stuff is being bought left, right, and centre, and coming into private collections and so on. It could have been seen in his eyes or his family's eyes to be a bit of a forerunner, that somebody who realized early on the value of a piece like that. But I really don't know what they would have thought of it.
He stayed a long time in Italy.
Mhm.
Do we have any evidence that he engaged with the Istituto di Corrispondenza Archaeologica or anything like that? Have you looked at their annual publications? Because they have, a little bit like the Antiquaries, they have lists of who attended meetings and things.
I haven't looked into that. No, she did. Hamilton Gray did.
Yeah.
That's where she got the connections. But I haven't looked into that, if he would have gone to any of those meetings
So
or
we've
not.
not got much idea about what he did in those 3 years.
No. I'm afraid I don't.
Please.
Have you looked into the subsequent interpretation and cataloguing from 1883 onwards, and how it went from being Etruscan to Roman?
No, I don't know why that information was forgotten. It appears to have been forgotten. I don't know why. I don't know, Andy, if you. We have the Yorkshire Museum collections and research manager. Yeah. So.
Quite a lot of things where, when you have the accession register, and then there would be a listing of what was in the museum, and quite a lot of information disappeared between those two things. And particularly in the early part of the 20th century, quite a lot of knowledge disappeared as well, and stuff. So it's not unique in that regard. And I would also say it's not uniquely grimy either. Sorry, mind if I?
No, yeah, please.
I was just trying to have a quick look at my phone, but do we have other records of donation from the Atkinsons that would suggest that there was a collection of material donated over a period of time, or is this their only donation?
That's, as far as I know, the only donation, yeah. But we were in particular looking for that. And so it would perhaps repay the donation lists before and after.
Yeah, I've got a digital version, I couldn't get it work on my phone.
Okay.
To look for the names.
Yeah.
I could do that, please.
Yeah, okay.
Any other questions or comments, please?
Is there any significance in his life history to the year which it's being donated?
No, he was already dead when it was donated. His younger brother donated it. But his younger brother is still living in that grand house. And it was actually, I think, 1883, he died 3 years later. It could be that he was just downsizing, as we call it now. But I don't think there's no significance known to me why he donated it in that year.
Well, if there are no further questions or comments, can we thank Maureen again for an absolutely splendid presentation?
Thank you.
I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 13th of November, when we'll hear a paper, The Melsonby Hall of Vehicles and Power in Late Iron Age North Yorkshire, by Dr. Sophie Adams Fellow and Professor Tom Moore Fellow. Meeting stands adjourned. There's a reception outside. Please do join us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.